Victor Ashcroft straightened his cufflinks in the doorway of the Iron Ridge land office and smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows how a thing is going to end. "Tell her," he said to the clerk behind the desk, not bothering to look at Evelyn at all, "that the employment contract she signed contains a residency clause. She leaves the territory, she forfeits every dollar she's owed. 6 months of wages. Gone." Evelyn stood very still. She had learned, over years of living near this man, that stillness was the only armor that cost him nothing to see through. "And the ranch?" she asked. Victor finally looked at her. "Mr. Boone will receive notice of the water rights claim by Friday. If he chooses to contest it—" He paused, letting the silence do the work his lawyers charged him $400 an hour to do. "Well, winter is a terrible time to be without legal counsel." That was the moment Evelyn Harper understood that running had never been an option. It had only ever been a delay. If you've ever had someone try to take from you the one thing you finally built for yourself, stay with me. Hit the like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what comes next. Because this is only the beginning. The stagecoach from Cheyenne deposited Evelyn Harper and her suitcase in the frozen street outside the Iron Ridge post office on a Tuesday morning in November, and the driver did not wait to make sure she was steady before he snapped the reins and moved on. She stood there for a moment, gripping the suitcase handle with both hands because it was something solid to hold, and looked at the town that was supposed to be her fresh start. Iron Ridge, Wyoming was not the kind of place that invited inspection. It sat at the base of a long gray ridge like something that had been dropped there and never quite found its footing. The main street was unpaved, rutted from wagon wheels, and already dusted with early snow that had turned gray at the edges from foot traffic and horse dung. There were maybe 15 buildings she could count from where she stood. A general store, a land office, a livery, 2 saloons, a barber shop, and a scattering of establishments whose purpose wasn't immediately legible to someone arriving from a city. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and livestock and something damp underneath, like the earth itself was waterlogged. She had seen worse. She reminded herself of that. Evelyn was 31 years old, though most people who met her for the first time guessed younger and then revised upward after 5 minutes of conversation. She had brown hair the color of creek mud in autumn, kept pinned back with 3 pins because she'd lost the 4th in Cheyenne, and green eyes that her mother had once described as the color of trouble, which her mother had meant as a compliment. She was not beautiful in any way that made men stop talking mid-sentence, but she had a quality that was harder to name and more durable, a kind of attentiveness, a steadiness in the way she looked at things, as if she was taking careful inventory and not particularly alarmed by what she found. The advertisement in the Cheyenne Gazette had read, "Housekeeper and infant caretaker sought. Boone Ranch, Iron Ridge. Inquire at post office. Wages fair for the right woman. No references required if character is sound." It was that last line that had caught her. No references required, because she had no references she could safely use. She pushed through the post office door, a brass bell announcing her arrival to a woman of about 60 who looked up from behind a counter stacked with parcels and immediately assigned Evelyn a category. The category, Evelyn could tell, was not a flattering one. "Help you?" "I'm here about the Boone Ranch advertisement. I rode ahead from Cheyenne, Evelyn Harper." The woman's expression didn't exactly warm, but it shifted, the way a door shifts when someone tests the latch. "He's expecting someone," she acknowledged. "Didn't say when." "My coach was 2 days late out of Laramie. Road conditions." The woman studied her in the direct, unbothered way that frontier women had, as if social niceties were a luxury that had been rationed out of existence. "You got experience with infants?" "My sister had 3 and 4 years. I was the one who kept the household together while she recovered." "Boone's girl is 4 months old, born in July. Mother passed 6 weeks after." Evelyn absorbed that without letting it show on her face what it cost her to hear. A mother dead 6 weeks after childbirth. An infant who had spent more of her life without a mother than with one. A man raising a baby alone on a cattle ranch in Wyoming in November. "I understand," she said. "I don't think you do yet," the woman said, not unkindly. "But you might." She reached beneath the counter and produced a hand-drawn map on the back of an envelope. "Boone Ranch is 4 miles south. You'll need to arrange a horse or a wagon. Hicks at the livery will take you for 50 cents if you can wait an hour." Evelyn looked at the map, then at the window, then back at the woman. "Can I walk it?" The postmistress considered her. "In those boots?" Evelyn looked down at her city boots. Leather-soled, not waterproof, not built for 4 miles of frozen Wyoming terrain. "I've walked worse," she said, which was not entirely true, but she said it like it was. The woman behind the counter almost smiled. "Wait an hour," she said. "Hicks won't cheat you. He's got a daughter your age. Makes him decent to women traveling alone." So Evelyn waited. She sat on the bench outside the post office with her suitcase at her feet and watched Iron Ridge go about its morning business, which was not extensive. A man hauled a barrel of something into the general store. 2 boys chased a dog through the gap between buildings. A woman in a dark wool coat crossed the street without looking at Evelyn and disappeared into the milliner's shop. 3 men came out of the nearer saloon, too early for drinking, so they must have slept there, and the tallest of them paused when he noticed Evelyn. "You the woman from Cheyenne?" he called. Not hostile, just direct, the way people were when small towns meant no privacy. "Depends who's asking," she said. He shrugged. "Word got around. Boone put out the advertisement 6 weeks ago. 3 women came before you. First one left after a week. Second one lasted 4 days. Third one..." He glanced at his companions. "Well, she left before she even made it to the house. Turned right around at the gate." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "What's wrong with the house?" "Nothing wrong with the house," he paused. "It's more the man in it." She considered asking what that meant, but decided she'd find out soon enough, and it was better to find out for herself. "Thank you for the information," she said. He tipped his hat and went on his way. Hicks at the livery was a lean man in his mid-50s who smelled of hay and horse liniment and said almost nothing during the 4-mile wagon ride, except to point out a frozen creek crossing that she should know about for future reference. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench with her suitcase between her knees and watched the land open up as they moved south, the ridge receding behind them, the flat country spreading out in gray-brown waves of dormant grass and bare scrub, the sky pressing down close and white. The ranch announced itself first through the fence line. 3 rails, recently repaired in some sections and falling apart in others, as if the work had started with energy and run out of it somewhere in the middle. Then a gate, plain wood, no name on it. Then a track leading toward a cluster of low buildings. A main house, a barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, a corral with 6 horses standing motionless in the cold. Hicks pulled up at the edge of the yard. "I'll leave you here," he said. "You don't pull up to the house?" Boone doesn't like people in his yard unless he's expecting them. He's expecting you, technically, but Hicks shrugged. "Just walk up. He'll hear you." She climbed down, took her suitcase, and crossed the yard toward the front door of the house. It was a solid house, like 1 story, well built originally, stone foundation, wood frame that had weathered without rotting. But the porch railing was broken on one side. The step had a board that needed replacing. The window shutters on the east side hung at angles, one of them with a hinge missing. She did not reach the door before it opened. Silas Boone was not what she had constructed in her head during the 4-mile ride. She had imagined, not consciously, just the way imagination fills in blanks, someone older, someone more visibly diminished, a man marked by grief the way grief marks the face, hollowing it out, softening it. Silas Boone was not softened. He was 38, maybe 39, with dark hair and dark eyes, and the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something that was severe without being cruel. He was broader across the shoulder than the doorframe easily accommodated. He stood in it without filling it entirely, one hand on the frame, watching her cross the last 20 feet of his yard with an expression that was not unfriendly but was very, very careful. He looked like a man who had learned to be careful the hard way. "Miss Harper," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Boone." She stopped at the porch steps. "I apologize for the delay. The road from Laramie..." "I know about the road. Come in." He stepped back. She climbed the steps, noted the loose board with one part of her mind, and went inside. The house was warm. A fire in the stone hearth at the far end of the main room, feeding heat through the whole structure. And it was clean in the particular way that a man cleans when he knows a woman is coming, but doesn't entirely know what clean means to a woman. The floor had been swept, the dishes were washed, or at least stacked, but the curtains hadn't been opened in what looked like weeks, and there was a quality to the air. Something pressed down, unmoving, that Evelyn recognized as the air of a house where grief had settled in and not yet been persuaded to leave. There was a wooden cradle near the hearth. In it, a baby slept on her back with her small fists raised beside her head. Evelyn set her suitcase down without thinking about it and crossed to the cradle and looked in. The baby was 4 months old and had the dark hair of her father and the round, unguarded face of someone who had not yet learned that the world required guardedness. She was breathing with the deep, full-body commitment that only the very young manage, her whole chest rising and falling, her lips parted, her fingers loosening and curling in some private dream. Evelyn straightened up and found Silas watching her from across the room. Not suspicious, exactly. Evaluating. "She's healthy?" Evelyn asked. "She's healthy." A pause. "She doesn't sleep well at night." "Most don't at this age." "The last woman who came, she said my daughter cried too much." Evelyn looked back down at the sleeping baby. "Babies cry because they need something. The question is figuring out what." Silence from across the room. Then, "Sit down, Miss Harper. I'll explain what the work is." She sat. He remained standing, which might have been a power gesture, except that he seemed like a man who simply didn't sit unless he had to. Too much energy moving under that stillness, too much habit of keeping himself ready to move. He told her the work plainly, without softening or elaborating. Care for Lydia, who at 4 months was not yet on solid food and required feeding every 2 to 3 hours through the night. Formula when necessary, as nursing was no longer possible. Keep the house, cooking, cleaning, laundry, help with whatever ranch task she was capable of when he needed an extra pair of hands, which he'd said mattered less than the other two, but he was being honest that it would come up. The wages were $30 a month, with room and board included. There was a bedroom off the kitchen that had belonged to his wife's younger sister before she'd left in September. He said his wife's sister with the same flatness he used for everything else, but Evelyn caught something. A breath held just a fraction longer than normal, released in a way that cost him something small. "How did you lose your wife?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out the way things come out when you've been trained to speak carefully for a long time and briefly forget. Silas looked at her with those careful dark eyes. "Childbirth complications," he said. "Fever after. Took her in 2 weeks." "I'm sorry." "Yes." He said it like a period at the end of a sentence. Not unkind, just done. "The bedroom is through there. Supper's at 6. I don't eat before then. I'm usually out until late afternoon." He reached for his coat on the hook by the door. "I'll give you time to settle." He was at the door before she could ask the question that had been forming since she'd walked in, since she'd looked at this house and seen the broken railings and the missing hinge and the weeks of unopened curtains. "Mr. Boone." He stopped but didn't turn all the way around. "The 3 women before me. Did any of them leave because of something you did or something the town did?" A pause long enough that she wasn't sure he was going to answer. "Both," he said, and he went out. The first week was a process of learning that had very little to do with Lydia, who turned out to be exactly what her father had said. Healthy, not especially fussy, needing nothing more than warmth and feeding and the occasional human voice to orient herself in the dark. Evelyn could manage that. She'd managed that for 3 years in her sister's house, and she'd manage it here. What she was less prepared for was the silence of Silas Boone. Not hostile silence. Not the silence of a man who resented her presence or was counting her failures. It was the silence of a man who had sealed off a significant portion of himself behind a door that he not only kept locked, but had nearly forgotten was there. He came in at dusk, smelling of cattle and cold. He ate whatever she'd made without complaint or comment. He asked 1 or 2 functional questions. Whether Lydia had taken her formula well, whether they needed anything from town, whether the woodpile was holding. Then he went to bed. And at 2 in the morning, when Lydia woke crying, Evelyn heard the sound from down the hall. The same sound every night for the first 3 nights before she'd figured it out. The sound of him sitting up. Of him swinging his feet to the floor and then stopping. Because she was there. Because it wasn't his job anymore. She lay in her own bed and listened to him stop and then go still. And then, after a long time, lie back down. On the 4th night, she was passing through the hall with Lydia on her shoulder when she saw the light under his door. She knocked once, quietly. The door opened. He stood there in a flannel shirt and trousers, barefoot, his hair disordered, holding a kerosene lamp. Behind him, through the open door, she could see a book on the bed that looked like it hadn't been turned for a while. "She's fine," Evelyn said, adjusting Lydia's weight. "I just wanted you to know, in case you were listening." Something moved across his face, too fast to read. "She likes this," Evelyn said, demonstrating. She shifted Lydia to rest chest to chest, turned sideways, swaying very slightly. Lydia's eyes drifted toward closed. The heartbeat, the warmth. She doesn't need to be fed, she just needs... She stopped. She just needs to know she's not alone. Silas looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he reached out, one hand, careful as a man handling something he was afraid of, and touched the top of Lydia's head. One brief, light touch. Lydia sighed in her sleep. He pulled his hand back. "Good night, Miss Harper," he said, and closed the door. The town of Iron Ridge formed its opinion of Evelyn Harper in the first week and saw no particular reason to revise it. The postmistress, whose name was Marta Feld, Evelyn learned, was the most neutral. She watched without verdict. The wives of the ranchers who passed through for supplies regarded Evelyn with a combination of curiosity and a particular brand of judgment that frontier women had developed for women who arrived alone in places where arriving alone was considered a statement of failure or desperation. The men were not unkind exactly, but there was a quality to how they looked at her, a measuring quality, the same look she'd seen all her adult life whenever she found herself somewhere she wasn't expected. She made her first supply run to town 12 days after her arrival, loading a wagon with the list Silas had given her and an extra list she'd made herself of things the household needed that he either hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered to write down. Mending thread, lamp oil that wasn't nearly as depleted as she'd initially thought, soft cloth for Lydia, 2 hooks for the kitchen that would keep the pots from stacking on the floor. Gerald Maines, who ran the general store, was a heavy-set man of 50 with a pleasant face and the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime making people comfortable enough to spend money. He helped her load the wagon and then, while she was tallying the bill, said with the careful casualness of a man who meant something, "You settling in all right out at the ranch?" "Fine, thank you." "Boone can be..." A pause. "He's a private man." "I've noticed. 3 women before you didn't stick. People in town started to wonder if the position was..." He seemed to search for the word. "Manageable." Evelyn looked up from the bill. "It's manageable," she said pleasantly. Maines studied her for a moment and seemed to revise whatever category he'd placed her in. Slightly. "Well," he said, "you need anything? We're here." It was not warmth, but it was something. The first real test came in week 3, which is when Wyoming decided that November was being too gentle and corrected itself. The storm came in from the northwest on a Wednesday night, the temperature dropping 18 degrees in 4 hours, wind building from a nuisance to something structural, something that tested the house's integrity at every seam. Silas had been in town that afternoon for what he'd said would be 2 hours and stretched into 4, and when the storm hit at dusk, he still wasn't back. Evelyn fed Lydia, stoked the fire, checked the window casings for drafts she already knew were there, and stuffed them with the extra cloth she'd bought specifically for this, and then did what needed doing. She put on Silas's spare canvas coat from the hook by the back door, too large by 4 inches in every direction, and went out to the barn. The horses were nervous. They smelled the storm the way animals do, with their whole bodies, and 2 of them were moving in their stalls in a way that was not quite panic yet, but was heading there. Evelyn had not grown up around horses. She'd grown up in a house with a small garden and no animals to speak of. But she had spent enough time in her sister's stable to know that nervous horses in a closed barn were a fire risk if they kicked out a lamp and a cold risk if the barn door failed. She secured the door. She checked the lamp mounts. She moved between the stalls, not trying to soothe in a way she couldn't back up, just being present. A steady voice, a non-threatening posture, the ordinary sounds of a person doing ordinary work. It took 20 minutes. By the end of it, 2 of the horses had lowered their heads and the others had stopped their restless movement. She went back inside, shed the canvas coat, and checked Lydia. Silas came in at 8 o'clock, ice in his beard and a cut on his forearm from what looked like a fence wire that had snapped in the wind and gotten him before he could step back. He came through the door with the energy of a man still running at full capacity from the emergency of getting home through what had become, in the 3 hours since dark, a serious storm. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at the fire, built up past what it had been when he left. Looked at the kitchen, supper on the stove, covered, kept warm. Looked at Lydia in the cradle, sleeping, then looked at Evelyn. "The barn," he said. It wasn't a question. "I went out when the storm built. They were starting to stress." He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and unwound the scarf from his neck and sat down at the table. Just sat, the way a man sits when his legs have decided that the emergency is over, whether the rest of him has caught up or not. "Caleb, the hand I've got coming Thursday. He's the one who usually does that. Caleb isn't here Thursday yet." Silence. He looked at his hands on the table. "Thank you," he said. 2 words quietly, to the table. She put the bowl in front of him. "Your arm needs cleaning," she said. "It's fine. It has fence wire rust in it." He looked up, she looked back. Something shifted between them in the air. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the first small evidence that warmth was theoretically possible between 2 people who were both stubborn and both honest. "All right," he said. She cleaned the wound. He ate. The storm hammered the windows for 6 hours. Lydia slept through most of it, waking once at 2 and settling back down in 10 minutes. In the morning, the world outside was white and still, and Silas Boone, eating breakfast across from her, said, "The east shutter needs a hinge. I've been meaning to get to it." "I know," Evelyn said. "I found the hinge in the supply shed. I can put it on this afternoon if you show me where the tools are." He set down his coffee cup. "You can put on a door hinge," he said. Not skeptical, just recalibrating. "My father was a carpenter," she said, "before he was anything else." A pause. Who else was he after? It was the first question Silas Boone had asked her about herself that wasn't functional. She recognized it for what it was. Tentative, probably involuntary, and important precisely because it was both. "Somebody who left," she said, and she picked up her own coffee cup, and they sat in the post-storm quiet with that between them. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest, and in a house that had been empty of honesty for a long time, honest felt like something to build on. But the letter arrived on a Thursday, which was 3 weeks after Evelyn had, and it came addressed to her in a hand she recognized before she'd fully registered seeing it. Victor Ashcroft had a particular way of forming letters, precise, controlled, with an excessive pressure on the downstrokes that she had once thought was elegant and had later understood as control expressing itself through paper and ink. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy. The return address was Denver. She took it into her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a full 3 minutes before she opened it. The letter was 3 paragraphs. Victor was economical, always, with words that didn't serve a purpose. The first paragraph expressed his hope that she had found a situation to her satisfaction. The second paragraph reminded her, with the calm specificity of a man who had lawyers review his correspondence, that the engagement she had broken without formal notice carried certain legal implications that he had thus far chosen not to pursue. The third paragraph said that he was planning a trip through Wyoming in the coming month on business, and would appreciate the opportunity to speak with her in person. Appreciate the opportunity was the kind of phrase that meant, I will not be taking no as an answer. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she folded it, put it in the pocket of her apron, and went to start supper. And she told herself that 3 weeks was not enough time to have anything worth protecting and that this man could not take from her what she didn't yet have. She told herself that 3 or 4 more times while she was peeling potatoes. She almost believed it. Yuck. Caleb turned out to be 19 years old, freckled, with the nervous energy of a young dog that had been well treated but couldn't quite convince itself yet that the good treatment would hold. He arrived Thursday as promised, took up residence in the small bunkhouse beside the barn, and threw himself at the ranch work with an enthusiasm that Evelyn gathered was partly genuine and partly a strategic effort to avoid being sent back wherever he'd come from. He was also, she noticed quickly, quietly terrified of Silas, the kind of terrified that was actually respect operating at full volume, which was different from fear and healthier, but produced similar body language. "Does he ever," Caleb started on Saturday, while Evelyn was bringing water to the barn and he was mending a stirrup strap. He stopped himself. "Does he ever what?" Evelyn asked. "Get less—" He seemed to search for the right word and couldn't find it. "Quiet?" Caleb looked up, relieved. "Yeah. I don't know yet," she said. "But he thanked me for something the other night, and he meant it. That's something." Caleb absorbed that with the seriousness of someone receiving valuable field intelligence. "He never thanked me for anything," he said. "What'd you do?" "Fixed the gate. Took me all afternoon." "Did he notice?" "He said the gate was fixed. Does that count?" Evelyn considered it. "For now," she said. "For now it counts." The first time Silas held Lydia in Evelyn's presence, held her with any evident ease, any suggestion that the act was not a managed performance of necessity, but something that belonged to him, was on a Sunday, a full month after Evelyn's arrival, and it happened sideways, the way most real things happen. He'd come in from a long cold morning checking fence in the north pasture, and Lydia was awake and fussing in the particular way she fussed when she'd been fed and changed, and simply wanted. The wanting being the whole of it, the absence of something she didn't have language for. Evelyn was up to her elbows in bread dough, which was not a thing you could easily abandon mid-need without wasting the morning's work, and she said without thinking, "Can you take her for a minute? She needs to be held." And Silas, who had barely touched his daughter in a month beyond what the mechanics of feeding and diapering required, crossed the room and picked her up. He was clumsy about it at first. She could see that, the stiffness in his arms, the slight panic in his face. And then Lydia grabbed his collar with both fists, the way infants grab things, with complete investment, and looked up at his face with her dark eyes that were so entirely his eyes that it was almost unkind. And something happened in Silas Boone that Evelyn witnessed by the way his shoulders came down from where they'd been living for months somewhere around his ears. He stood there in the kitchen with his daughter on his chest and watched her grab his collar and look at him and did not say anything at all. Evelyn kept kneading the bread. After a while, Silas began very slightly to move. Just a shift of weight, hip to hip, the way you move when you're trying not to be caught moving. Lydia's eyes drifted. Her grip on the collar loosened. "She's almost out," Evelyn said quietly, not looking up. "Yeah," Silas said, quietly. "I see that." He stood there until the bread was done and Lydia was entirely asleep. And when he finally put her in the cradle, he stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and looked at his daughter's sleeping face with an expression that Evelyn was careful not to watch directly because it was the kind of thing a person needed privacy for. Then he went back outside. But something had been opened in that house, in that kitchen, on that Sunday, and both of them knew it even if neither of them said so, and from that day forward it was subtly, incrementally different. The way a house is different in spring when someone opens the first window of the season and lets the air move through it. Not fixed, not healed, just different, starting to breathe. The bread had been a turning point, though neither of them would have called it that. What changed was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that only becomes visible in hindsight. The accumulation of small adjustments, the way a house settles differently after someone has been living in it long enough to belong. Silas didn't start talking more. He didn't suddenly lose the habit of silence that had grown into something structural over the months since his wife died. But the silence itself changed its quality. It became less like a wall and more like weather, something you moved through rather than something that stopped you. December arrived the way Wyoming Decembers arrive. without asking permission and without offering alternatives. The temperature in the first week dropped low enough that the water in the kitchen bucket had a skim of ice on it by morning, and the horse's breath came in long, visible plumes when Caleb led them out to water. Evelyn added another blanket to Lydia's cradle, checked the window casings she'd already stuffed twice, and started waking an hour earlier each morning to have the fire built up before anyone else was moving. She didn't mention this to Silas. There was no point in mentioning it. It was simply what needed doing. It was Caleb who noticed first. "You're up before dawn," he said one morning, coming through the kitchen on his way to the barn, surprised to find her already at the stove. "So are you," she said. "I got the horses." He pulled his coat tighter. "You don't have to do that at the fire. Mr. Boone does it when he's up first." "He's up at 5. Lydia's up at 4:30. Caleb absorbed this with the expression of someone receiving information that reorganized something previously simple. "Oh," he said, and then, with the straight-faced sincerity of a 19-year-old who had not yet learned to be less earnest, "You don't sleep much, do you?" "I sleep enough," Evelyn said, which was approximately true. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, "My ma used to do that. Always up before anybody, so the house was warm before anybody had to feel it cold." Evelyn looked at him. He was already at the door, already pulling it open to the gray pre-dawn air, and she thought she might say something, but the moment passed and she let it. Some things you just heard and held. The fence on the north boundary failed in the second week of December. Not dramatically. No storm to blame, no single catastrophic break. It simply gave way in 3 sections simultaneously, the way things do when they've been compromised slowly, and the accumulation finally exceeds what the structure can hold. Silas discovered it at dawn on a Tuesday and spent the morning assessing and the afternoon in a controlled, focused anger that expressed itself almost entirely in the speed and precision with which he worked. Evelyn found out when Caleb came to the kitchen door at midday, red-faced from cold, saying that Mr. Boone had said he needed her to ride out with supplies and an extra pair of hands if she was willing. She was willing. She'd been on a horse exactly 4 times in her life before Iron Ridge, and she'd told Silas this on her 3rd day at the ranch because she thought honesty about limitations was better than pretending. He'd said, "You'll learn." Not a promise or an offer. A statement of what was going to happen, like saying the sun would come up. And over the past 5 weeks, in pieces, between other things she had been learning. Walk, trot. The particular way you sit when the horse changes speed beneath you, the weight going into the heel rather than the toe. She rode out to the north fence with Caleb leading the supply horse and found Silas already 3 sections deep into the repair, working with the focused efficiency of a man who has done this so many times that his hands could manage it while his mind did something else. He looked up when she arrived, assessed the fact that she'd made it out without incident, gave her a single nod. "Can you hold wire?" he said. "Tell me how." He showed her. It wasn't complicated, but it required a sustained strength in the hands and arms, holding the tension in a section of fence wire while he worked the fastening, and it was cold enough that within 20 minutes her fingers were aching in a way that started as discomfort and progressed toward something more serious. She didn't say anything. She held the wire. Silas was working 2 feet from her and she could feel his attention. Not on her face, just a peripheral awareness of her hands, her grip, whether she was managing. After the 3rd section, he said without looking up, "There's a pair of lined gloves in the left saddlebag." She got them without comment. They were his, sized for his hands, enormous on her, but the lining was sheepskin and the warmth they offered was immediate and almost embarrassing in how much she needed it. "Thank you," she said. He was already on to the next section. They worked until the light failed, which in December in Wyoming happened around 4 in the afternoon, and they rode back mostly in silence, the kind of silence that came from shared cold and shared work, and the particular exhaustion of an afternoon spent doing something physically demanding that you were not entirely trained for. Caleb rode ahead, already mentally at supper. Halfway back, Silas said, "You didn't tell me your hands were going. I was managing. You were past managing by section 2. She looked at him. He was looking at the track ahead, his profile exact and unreadable in the dim afternoon light. "How did you know?" "Your grip changed." A pause. "You compensated." She thought about that for a moment. About the fact that he had been watching her hands from 2 feet away in the middle of a fence repair and had noticed the exact point at which her grip changed. "I would have said something if I couldn't hold it," she said. "I know you would have." Another pause. "Next time, say something before that." She looked at him again. He still wasn't looking at her, but the line of his jaw had something in it that she'd come to recognize, the slight softening that meant he was closer to something human than he usually let himself get. "All right," she said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than it had been in the first weeks. Something in it had turned over, the way ground turns over in spring, and underneath it was darker and richer than the surface had suggested. The first Saturday of December, Evelyn went to town alone. She needed supplies, practical things, household things, nothing that required explanation. And Silas had told her to take the smaller wagon and the bay horse, who was the steadiest of the six and would give her no trouble. She'd gotten reasonably competent with the wagon over the past weeks, and the road to Iron Ridge was flat enough that competency was sufficient. She was loading the last of the supplies at Mains's store when she heard her name from across the street. She turned. The man standing outside the land office was tall, well-dressed for the frontier, or overdressed, which is different, in a dark coat that was too clean and boots that were too polished for the mud and snow of an Iron Ridge December. He had the kind of handsome that photographs well. Strong jaw, even features, dark blonde hair under a hat that cost more than most of Iron Ridge's residents made in a month. He was smiling at her with the particular smile she had learned over the course of 2 years to recognize as the smile that preceded something she wouldn't like. Victor Ashcroft had not written a second letter. He had simply arrived. Her first instinct, the one she'd had since she was 24 years old and understood for the first time what this man was capable of, was to get smaller, to become less visible, to handle this quietly and efficiently, and not let anyone see that anything was wrong. She did not act on that instinct. She crossed the street. "Victor," she said. "Evelyn." He looked her up and down with the assessing quality that passed for affection in his register. "You look well. The frontier suits you." "What are you doing here?" "I told you in my letter. I had business in Wyoming, in Iron Ridge specifically." He spread his hands in a gesture of pleasant reasonableness. "It's a growing territory. There are opportunities." He glanced at the wagon, at the Boone Ranch supplies loaded in the back, at the bay horse tied to the post. "You're working as a housekeeper." "Yes." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he always had, with a slight emphasis, as if it were a title he was conferring rather than a name she'd been given. "This is not what I had planned for you." "I know what you planned for me," she said. "That's why I left." Victor's smile didn't waver. That was one of the things about him. He maintained pleasantness the way other people maintained a fence line, as a perimeter, as a way of defining what was inside and what wasn't. "I'm staying at the Douglas Hotel for 2 weeks," he said. "I'd like you to have dinner with me, to talk." "I won't do that. As a courtesy, surely 2 years together." "Victor." She said it quietly, without heat, because heat gave him something to respond to. "I don't owe you courtesy or conversation. I wrote to release the engagement. You chose not to acknowledge that. That's not my responsibility to resolve over dinner." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Victor was too careful for visible anger in public. Something colder, more considered. "The family at whose house you're employed," he said. "Boone, is it? Widower. Infant daughter. I understand he's been having some legal difficulties with the county water authority." The coldness in her chest that had been there since she saw him across the street spread downward, into her stomach. "He hasn't been having any legal difficulties," she said carefully. "Not yet," Victor said pleasantly. He touched the brim of his hat. "Dinner at 7, if you change your mind. I do hope you will." He turned and went back into the land office as if the conversation had concluded in the way he'd intended it to conclude, which it had not, except that he didn't appear to know that yet. Evelyn stood in the street for a moment. Then she untied the bay horse, climbed into the wagon, and drove back to the ranch. She did not tell Silas that night. She turned it over during supper, turned it over while she put Lydia down, turned it over in the dark of her room while the wind worked at the window casings and the fire banked itself lower in the other room. There was a version of this where she said nothing, and Victor left in 2 weeks because she hadn't given him anything to work with. There was a version where he didn't leave. She had spent 2 years learning which version of Victor Ashcroft showed up when he didn't get what he wanted. She told Silas the next morning. She waited until Caleb had gone to the barn and Lydia was sleeping and the breakfast things were cleared, and then she poured a second cup of coffee for each of them, a thing she'd started doing without planning to, and which Silas had started accepting without commenting on. And she sat down across from him and said, "There's something I need to tell you." Silas set down his coffee cup. His whole attention turned toward her in that way he had, complete, unhurried, slightly unnerving. She told him, not everything, not the full history of 2 years, the slow way that Victor's attention had gone from something that felt like being chosen to something that felt like being owned, but the relevant facts, the engagement she'd broken, the letter, the arrival, the conversation outside the land office, and the specific phrase that Victor had used about legal difficulties with the county water authority. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's been in the land office," he said. "He went back inside when we were done talking." He picked up his coffee cup, put it down again. "Harlan Price runs the land office. He's not," a pause, choosing words. "He's not particular about who he does business with, if the money's right." "Victor's money is always right," Evelyn said. Silas looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not alarm, something closer to the look he had when he was assessing a situation from all sides before deciding where to stand. "The water rights," he said. "There's been a boundary question on the East Creek for about 2 years, never resolved because Abe Torrance, who owns the land east of us, and I agreed it didn't need to be. If someone filed a formal claim and had the money to push it through Price, could they take it? They could delay it long enough to cost me through winter." He was speaking plainly, which she had come to understand was his version of worry. Not the performance of worry, but the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a problem's dimensions. "The cattle need that water. If I'm in a legal dispute that cuts off access while the case processes..." He stopped. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. I didn't know he would follow me here. I didn't think he'd go this far. How long have you known him?" 2 years. We were engaged for 8 months of that." Silas looked at her steadily. "You broke it off?" "Yes." "Why?" It was not the question she expected him to ask, or rather, it was the question she expected him not to ask, because it required him to want to know something about her beyond what was functionally necessary, and Silas Boone had spent 5 weeks keeping a very careful line between what was functionally necessary and what was personal. She decided to answer it honestly. "Because I realized that every decision I'd made in 2 years had been shaped by what he would think of it," she said. "What I wore, who I talked to, where I applied for work. I woke up one morning and couldn't remember the last time I'd done something just because I wanted to." A pause. "I didn't want to wake up at 40 and still be working out the answer to that question." Silas was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she heard the wind pick up outside, heard a horse shift in the barn, heard Lydia make a small sound in her sleep and settle again. "He's not going to leave because you ignore him," Silas said finally. "No." "Then we deal with it." He picked up his coffee cup and stood. "I'll go talk to Abe Torrance today. If we get the boundary agreement in writing before Ashcroft can file anything formally..." He was already thinking past her, into the problem's logistics, which was both slightly impersonal and genuinely reassuring. "Silas?" She used his first name without planning to. It was the first time. He paused. "I'm sorry," she said again, "that I brought this to your door." He stood there with the coffee cup in his hand and looked at her, and his face did the thing it sometimes did where it seemed to be deciding between 2 or 3 different responses and landing on none of them. What he finally said was, "You didn't bring it. He followed it. That's not the same thing." He put the cup on the counter and went to get his coat. Abe Torrance was a rancher of 62, with a face like old boot leather, and an opinion of lawyers that he expressed in language Evelyn was glad Lydia was too young to understand when he came by the ranch that evening after Silas had spoken to him. The boundary agreement was written on standard paper, signed by both men, and witnessed by Caleb, who signed his name in the careful letters of someone who had been taught to write by someone who took it seriously. "Is it legally sufficient?" Evelyn asked Silas after Abe had left. "It's sufficient for what we need," Silas said. "Ashcroft would have to challenge the agreement, not just file a new claim. That changes the timeline and the cost." "He has money for the timeline and the cost." "I know." Silas folded the document and put it in the lockbox under the kitchen floor. "But it's harder than he thought it would be. Men like that—" He paused, crouching at the floor, not looking at her. "They're used to things being easy. When they're not, sometimes they make mistakes." She thought about that later, washing the supper dishes in the dim kitchen, the fire low behind her, the house quiet except for Lydia's breathing and the wind. Silas had called him men like that, which meant he knew the type, which meant he'd encountered the type somewhere before, and it had cost him something, and he had filed it in the part of himself where things that cost you something get filed, and he'd kept going. She found she wanted to know that story. She filed that away too. Victor's influence in Iron Ridge proved faster than she'd expected. By the end of his first week, 3 things had happened that she could trace to him even without direct evidence. Gerald Maines told her, with visible discomfort, that 2 of the ranchers who regularly bought supplies from the same account as Boone Ranch had raised questions about the ranch's financial stability, a phrase that had not come from Gerald's vocabulary and had not originated in Iron Ridge. The schoolteacher's wife, a woman named Henrietta Dale, who had previously been the closest thing to friendly that Evelyn had encountered in town, stopped making eye contact at the store. And a rumor reached Caleb, via the livery, via the saloon, via the particular telegraph system of small-town gossip, that Boone Ranch was having trouble keeping help, which was technically true in the past but was being presented as a current ongoing instability that reflected something wrong with the ranch rather than something temporary. "He's doing it in layers," Evelyn told Silas. They were in the kitchen. It was where most of their serious conversations happened, Evelyn had noticed, the way important conversations tend to happen in the rooms where life's daily mechanics take place, because those rooms don't have the formality that shuts conversation down. Silas was at the table with a cup of tea he'd been nursing for 20 minutes. Evelyn was standing at the window because she couldn't sit still. "First the water rights," she said, "then the reputation, then the suppliers maybe. Then the town starts to see the ranch as a liability, and he doesn't have to do much more. The isolation does his work for him." Silas was quiet. "He did this to someone else," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been putting it together for days. "A man named Coulter," Silas said, "2 towns east. Coulter had land Ashcroft wanted. He didn't want to sell. Ashcroft spent 8 months making Coulter seem like a bad risk to every person in that county. By the end of it, Coulter couldn't get credit at the bank, couldn't move his cattle to market through the usual routes, couldn't even hire hands because the word was out that working for Coulter meant being on the wrong side of a man with deep pockets." A pause. "Coulter sold for about 1/3 of what the land was worth." "You knew about him before I told you any of this," Evelyn said. "I knew his name. I didn't know he was the man you'd been engaged to." Silas looked up. "I should have told you I knew of him. I'm sorry I didn't." There it was again. The directness of a man who had decided that apology was just a thing you did when you'd made a mistake, not a performance. It kept catching her off guard. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "It might have if you'd known I already had a read on him." He wrapped both hands around the teacup. "What does he want from you, specifically?" Evelyn turned from the window. "He wants me to go back. He'd call it returning to the engagement, but that's not what it is." She tried to find the right words for something she'd spent 2 years understanding. "Victor doesn't want a wife. He wants a particular kind of household and a particular kind of woman to run it. And when he found me, he decided I was the version that fit what he'd already designed. Going back would mean—" She stopped. "Disappearing," Silas said quietly. She looked at him. "Not literally," he said. But, she agreed. They looked at each other across the kitchen for a long moment, and what passed between them wasn't romantic, wasn't anything as clear or as easy as that, but it was recognition. 2 people who had each, in their different ways, had large parts of themselves go dark because of what life had done to them, seeing in each other the particular shape of that particular kind of loss. Lydia woke in the next room, the small, escalating sounds of a baby building toward genuine displeasure. Evelyn went to get her. When she came back, Silas was still at the table, and he said without looking up from his tea, "I'm not going to let him take the water rights." "I know, and I'm not going to let him run you out of here." She stood with Lydia on her shoulder and looked at the back of his head and felt something in her chest that was either gratitude or something more complicated that she wasn't prepared to name yet. "You may not be able to prevent it," she said. "He has more money and more lawyers than—" "I know what he has." Silas stood, turned, and looked at her and Lydia together in that way he'd started doing. Not consciously, she thought, not with any intention she could put a name to, just looking. "I also know what he doesn't have." She waited. "He doesn't know this place," Silas said, "or these people. He came in with money and he's using it like that's the only tool available. Men like that, they don't understand that in a place like this." He paused, and she could see him deciding whether to finish the thought out loud and deciding to. "People remember who stood by them when things were hard. Ashcroft doesn't have any of that here. He's buying short-term moves. He doesn't know how to build anything longer." Evelyn considered that for a moment. Then she looked down at Lydia, who was studying her collar with the profound concentration that she brought to most objects at close range, and she said, "He's going to figure out eventually that it's not just about me, that he needs to take the ranch." "Yes," Silas said, "and when he does, it's going to get worse before it gets better." "Probably," she nodded. "All right." She shifted Lydia to her other shoulder. "Then we'd better be ready." Silas picked up his coat. He was going back out. There was always something that needed doing, always the ranch pulling at him the way something pulls at you when it's yours, and you know it needs you. But he paused at the back door with his hand on the frame, the same posture he'd had on her first day, when she'd walked across the yard and he'd watched her come, and he said, "You're not what I expected." She almost laughed. "What did you expect?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Someone who'd last 3 weeks," he said. "Maybe 4. I've lasted 6. "I know." A pause, brief, at the edge of something. "I'm glad you have." He went out. Evelyn stood in the kitchen with his daughter asleep on her shoulder, and the winter pressing at the windows, and the complicated warmth of a man's plainly spoken gratitude settling somewhere in the region of her sternum, and she thought, "This is the thing Victor cannot buy, and cannot take, and cannot counterfeit. This ordinary, imperfect, difficult thing, this was what he had followed her here to destroy." She held Lydia a little tighter. She was not going to let him. The signed boundary agreement between Silas and Abe Torrance bought them time, but time in a Wyoming winter is not the same as safety, and Evelyn understood the difference. Victor had been in Iron Ridge for 10 days when the first real damage showed up, not in the form of a legal filing, which she'd been watching for, but in the form of a conversation that Caleb overheard at the livery on a Thursday afternoon and reported to Evelyn that evening with the careful precision of someone who understood that the details mattered. 2 men, ranchers from the north end of the county, names Caleb didn't know, had been talking about Boone Ranch's water situation. Not the boundary agreement, not the legal question, the water itself. They were saying that the East Creek, the one that fed the main cattle trough through the lower pasture, had been running low for 2 seasons, and that any man thinking about buying Boone beef this spring might want to factor in the possibility that the herd would come through winter underweight. They said this the way people say things that have been put in their mouths by someone with more money than conscience, with just enough uncertainty that it sounded like concern rather than campaign. Caleb told it straight, without editorializing, and then looked at Evelyn with his freckled 19-year-old face, wearing the expression of someone who has brought bad news and isn't sure what to do with his hands now. "You did right telling me," Evelyn said. "Should I tell Mr. Boone?" "I'll tell him." Silas took the information the way he took most things, quietly, without immediate reaction, with the look of a man filing something in a place where he could find it later. Then he said, "The creek runs fine. It ran low in August because August was dry. Every creek in the county ran low in August." "I know that. But if enough people hear it enough times—" I know what happens. He was at the barn door checking the latch against the wind that had been building since midday. He didn't look at her. He's not just trying to take the water rights anymore. He's trying to make the ranch look like it's already dying, so that when he makes an offer, it looks like a rescue. Silas turned. The last of the evening light was behind him, and she couldn't fully read his face. He's done this before. You knew that. I knew that. The question is what we do before he gets far enough along that the story sticks. Evelyn had been thinking about that since Caleb's report, turning it over the way she turned problems over, from the practical side first, then the human side, then the place where those two things intersected. The people who matter most are the ones who actually know the ranch, she said. Abe Torrance knows the creek, the Hadley family. They've bought cattle from you for how long? 6 years? They need to hear from you directly, not a rumor correction. Just, they need to see you, see the operation, see that it's sound. She paused. And they need to see that the household is stable. Silas looked at her. Meaning you. Meaning me. A housekeeper who's still here after 6 weeks in winter with an infant is not a housekeeper at a failing operation. She said it plainly, without self-consciousness, because this was not the moment for self-consciousness. Victor is trying to make Boone Ranch look like something people should step back from. The counter to that is showing people what it actually is. A silence. Not long. There's a supply gathering at the Hadley place in 2 weeks, Silas said. Ranchers in the area share costs on winter feed. I usually go alone. Take me, Evelyn said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded and went inside, and she stood in the cold for a moment with the wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair and thought, this is the part where it gets harder before it gets easier, and she was right. The rumors changed shape in the following week, which told her Victor had noticed that the practical attack wasn't moving fast enough. What changed was the nature of what people were saying, or rather, who they were saying it about. The whispers about the ranch's water and financial stability were still circulating, but they had been joined by something more personal and more targeted, which was always the escalation she'd been waiting for because she knew Victor well enough to know that he didn't stay impersonal when impersonal wasn't working. Marta Feld told her. Marta had the particular honesty of a woman who had run a post office for 20 years and understood that information, like water, would find its level regardless, so you might as well direct it. There's talk, Marta said, on a morning when Evelyn had come in for the post. She said it without preamble, which Evelyn had come to appreciate. About you and Boone. About the nature of the arrangement. Evelyn kept her face neutral. What kind of talk? The kind that questions whether a young woman living in a widower's house is there for the reasons stated. Marta looked at her directly. I'm telling you because you should know, not because I believe it. I don't believe it, but someone is putting it out, and they're putting it out to the wives specifically, which means it'll hit the husbands through the back door, which is how these things work. Victor Ashcroft, Evelyn said. I don't know the man, but it started about 4 days after he arrived, so you can draw your own conclusions. Marta sorted a stack of envelopes with the efficiency of long practice. I've seen this before in 2 other towns I lived in. Man wants something he can't get directly, so he goes after the reputation. It's easier than law and cheaper than force. Evelyn stood with the post under her arm and felt the cold of it. Not the air cold, which she'd grown used to, but the other kind, the kind that came from understanding how a campaign like this worked and where its pressure points were. Victor wasn't going to file the water claim until he'd softened the ground around her enough that when she became the reason the ranch was struggling, the town would not be surprised. She was the lever. The ranch was what he'd pry loose with it. Thank you, Marta, she said. Don't thank me. Do something about it. The postmistress looked at her over the counter with the frank directness of a woman who has watched other women be managed into corners and has a low tolerance for watching it happen again. You've been here 6 weeks. People have seen you at the store, at the livery, twice at the church social. Don't look at me like that. I know you didn't go for the sermon. You went because it was a gathering and you're sensible. They've seen how you handle yourself. That's not nothing. It's not enough against money, Evelyn said. No, Marta agreed, but it's a foundation. Build on it. She told Silas that evening. All of it. The nature of the new rumors, Marta's read on the strategy, the specific pressure Victor was putting on the wives because wives moved information through communities in ways that husbands rarely tracked until the damage was done. Silas sat across the table from her, and his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was angry, but had decided that anger was not the useful tool for the current situation. She had learned to read that particular tension. It meant he was thinking hard and feeling harder and not letting either one get in the other's way. "He's making you the problem," Silas said. "He's making me the story. The problem, in his version, is that I'm here at all." "What does he think you'll do?" Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. "He thinks I'll leave. He thinks the reputation pressure will make the position untenable, and that I'll decide it's not worth the cost to you, and I'll come to him and tell him I'm going." She paused. "He's done it before. There was a woman in Denver, someone he worked with, who'd made the mistake of becoming his friend. When she turned down his business offer, the rumors started within a week. She left Denver inside of a month." "You're not leaving," Silas said. It came out flat, certain, like a fact about geography. She looked up at him. "If that's what you're thinking about," he said, "stop. That's not a solution. It would protect the ranch." "No," he said. "It would give him what he came for, and it would leave you without a position in the middle of December in Wyoming, and it would teach him that this works, which means the next time he wants something from somebody, he'll do it again." He said all of this with the same flat certainty, one statement following the next like fence posts. "It's not a solution." Evelyn felt something in her chest ease. Not fully, not by a lot, but enough. The particular ease that comes from having someone tell you that you don't have to carry something alone. Not because they're strong, but because they've decided to stand next to you, and that changes the weight. "Okay," she said. "The Hadley gathering is in 12 days, he said. "Before that, I want to talk to 2 or 3 of the ranchers individually, not about Ashcroft, about spring cattle prices, about the grazing situation north of the ridge, regular business, but face to face, so they've seen me recently when the rumors reached them." "And me?" He thought for a moment. "Come to town with me on Saturday. Not for errands, just come." She understood what he meant. Be visible, be present, be not a scandal in the most ordinary possible way, so that the story Victor was building had to fight the evidence of what people could actually see. It was a sensible strategy. It was also, she noted, the kind of strategy that would work better if what people saw was 2 people who seemed like they were on the same side. And she was not entirely sure that was something you could perform if it wasn't already true. She looked at Silas across the kitchen table and decided, with the calm honesty she'd developed over 31 years of being the person who looked directly at difficult things, that it might already be true. She wasn't ready to think about what that meant yet. Saturday came gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, the kind of cold that didn't relent even at midday. Silas drove the wagon, and Evelyn sat beside him with Lydia bundled in 2 blankets on her lap, and they rode the 4 miles to Iron Ridge in the easy half-silence that had become their normal. Not awkward, not forced, just 2 people comfortable enough to not fill every space. Lydia was 5 months old now and had recently developed opinions. She had an opinion about cold air on her face, which was negative, and an opinion about the movement of the wagon, which was positive, and an opinion about Evelyn's coat buttons, which were apparently fascinating. Evelyn let her grab the top button and work at it with the serious concentration of someone engaged in important research. "She's going to pull that off," Silas said, not looking over. "She's been trying for 10 minutes. She can't get the leverage." "She'll figure out the leverage." Evelyn looked down at Lydia, who had changed tactics and was now trying to bring the button to her mouth. "Not wrong," she said, and moved the button out of range, which produced a sound of outrage that lasted approximately 4 seconds before Lydia found Evelyn's thumb instead and decided that was acceptable. Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, a brief exhale that carried some warmth, and Evelyn felt it the way you feel a change in temperature. Small, but registering. They pulled up in front of Mains's store, and Silas helped her down from the wagon with Lydia, which was a practical gesture because her arms were full, but which also meant that for a moment they were standing very close together on the sidewalk outside the store, with his hand at her elbow and his daughter on her shoulder. And 3 people across the street watched this happen with the frank interest of a small town that has been given something to reconsider. She caught Marta watching from the post office window. Marta gave a small, decisive nod and turned back to her counter. Gerald Maines was warm, warmer than he'd been in her last 2 visits, which told her that the particular kind of warm Gerald had for Silas Boone was currently extending itself to her by association, and that this was not accidental because Gerald was a man who tracked the social weather of Iron Ridge, the way he tracked his inventory, carefully, because it affected his livelihood. "Miss Harper," he said. "Lydia's growing." He said it with the genuine pleasure men of a certain age have for babies they don't have to take home, and bent to look at her, and Lydia stared at him with her dark eyes and grabbed his finger when he offered it. "She's got a grip," Gerald said, delighted. "She gets that from her father," Evelyn said. Silas, standing behind her at the supply shelf, said nothing, but she felt a shift in the air behind her that she thought was him standing a little straighter. They stayed an hour, not because they needed an hour's worth of supplies, but because Silas moved through the store and the hardware next door and the brief stop at the land office, which Evelyn observed from outside with careful attention, with the unhurried quality of a man who had nothing to hide and no reason to be anywhere faster than this. People greeted him. He greeted them. He introduced her, not as the housekeeper, not with any qualifier, just Evelyn Harper, who keeps my household running. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Victor Ashcroft was not in evidence, which either meant he was somewhere she couldn't see or meant he had chosen not to be visible today, and she wasn't sure which was worse. They were at the wagon, ready to leave, when a man she hadn't met before crossed the street toward them with the particular stride of someone who has made a decision and is carrying it out before they lose their nerve. He was 50 maybe, with a weathered face and a sheepskin coat, and he put his hand out to Silas with the directness of men who have known each other long enough to skip the circling. "Silas, got a minute?" "Tom." Silas shook the hand. "Evelyn, this is Tom Hadley. The gathering's at his place." Hadley turned to her. He had the look of a man who had heard things and was looking at her to determine their accuracy. She had been looked at this way before, and she knew the only thing to do was look back. "Miss Harper," he said. "Heard you've been keeping the Boone place through the winter." "I have." "Heard some other things, too." He said it straight, which she respected. "Don't know how much of what I've heard is worth listening to." "That would depend on the source," Evelyn said. "There's a businessman at the Douglas Hotel," Hadley said. "Been buying drinks for half the county and telling people your employer's got water problems and financial problems and a housekeeper problem." He said the last item with a flatness that made clear what the housekeeper problem was supposed to consist of. "Man like that, buying that many drinks, he's either very generous or he wants something." "He wants something," Evelyn said. Hadley looked at her for another moment, then looked at Silas, then looked back at her. Whatever he was checking for, he seemed to find it in the alignment between what she said and how she said it, and the way Silas was standing beside her. "Well," he said, "Boone Ranch has been in my spring cattle purchase for 6 years. I'd want a pretty significant reason to change that." He looked at Silas. "You got water problems?" "No," Silas said. "You got the financial trouble they're talking about?" "No." Hadley nodded once, with the decisive brevity of a man whose time is worth something. "Then we'll see you in 12 days. He looked at Evelyn once more, and this time what was in his face was not evaluation, but something closer to a decision that had been made. "Miss Harper, the gathering's a family affair. Wives and children come. You'd be welcome." He walked away. Evelyn stood at the wagon and let out a breath she'd been holding since he'd first crossed the street. "That was the most efficient conversation I've witnessed in Wyoming," she said. "Tom Hadley doesn't believe in using 3 words when one will do," Silas said. He was watching the older man walk away, and there was something in his expression that she could only describe as relief wearing a careful disguise. "He's also the most connected rancher in the northern county. If he's visible at the gathering and his position is what it was just now..." He stopped. "Victor loses the rancher vote," Evelyn said. "Victor loses the rancher vote." She climbed into the wagon with Lydia, who had fallen asleep during Hadley's speech with the beautiful indifference of the very young to adult politics. "Silas," she said. He was climbing up the other side. He looked over. "The land office," she said. "I watched from outside while you were in there. Harlan Price. Was he?" "He'd already filed Victor's preliminary inquiry on the water rights," Silas said, "dated 4 days ago. The agreement with Abe should hold against it, but Price filed it anyway." "Can he do that?" "Price can file anything. Whether it holds is a different question." His jaw was tight again. "But it means Ashcroft's not bluffing anymore. He's actually paying Price to move the paperwork." She looked at the road ahead. The town of Iron Ridge was behind them, the ranch 4 miles forward, and between those 2 points was a stretch of winter Wyoming that didn't care about legal filings or reputation campaigns or the ambitions of men from Denver. "Then we need something in writing," she said, "not just the boundary agreement. Something that documents what Price has filed, when he filed it, and who initiated the inquiry. If Price is accepting money to file claims on behalf of a private individual, that's not just a land dispute. That's a conduct question." Silas looked at her with the expression he'd worn twice before, the one she'd first seen when she'd come in from the barn during the storm, the one she'd seen again when she'd told him about Victor that morning in the kitchen, the one that meant he was recalibrating something. "You know land law," he said. "My father's carpentry work was half in courthouse construction," she said. "I spent a lot of time in offices where legal arguments were happening. You absorb things." She paused. "I also spent 8 months engaged to a man who used lawyers the way other men use hammers. You absorb things there too." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know a man in Cheyenne, not a lawyer, works adjacent to that world, documents, records, that kind of thing. He's helped me before with a title question on the North Pasture. Can he come here, or do we need to go to him?" "I can write him. He might send someone." "Write him today," Evelyn said. He nodded and clicked the horse forward, and the wagon moved through the cold gray afternoon toward the ranch, and Lydia slept on, entirely unconcerned. The letter went out with the Tuesday post. 4 days later, on a Saturday that was so cold, the thermometer outside Mains's store read 11 degrees at noon, Victor Ashcroft came to Boone Ranch. He came alone, which surprised her. She had expected lawyers, or at least the deputy that she'd noticed speaking to him outside the land office twice in the past week, but he drove himself, in a hired buggy that was too light for the road conditions, and fishtailed twice on the ice before he pulled up in the yard, and he climbed down and stood in the cold in his good coat looking at the house like a man who has arrived somewhere and is deciding how to present himself. Evelyn saw him from the kitchen window first. She stood completely still for 3 seconds. Then she put Lydia in the cradle, checked the latch, and went to the back door and said to Caleb, who was working on a harness near the barn, "Go get Silas from the North Pasture. Now. Don't run. Don't make it look like anything. Just go." Caleb looked at the buggy in the yard and at her face and went. She went to the front door and opened it before Victor could knock. He was smiling. "Evelyn, I hoped you'd be in." "Mr. Ashcroft." She kept her hand on the door. "You're on private property." "I know that." He was looking past her, into the house, with the inventory quality she hated, the way he cataloged things, assessed them, valued or devalued them against some internal register she'd never had access to. "I wanted to see where you were living." "You have no business here." "I've filed a legal inquiry on the water rights for this property," he said pleasantly. "I'd argue that gives me a certain standing." "The inquiry will be contested, you know that." "Possibly." He stepped forward, not aggressively, just with the assumption of someone who has never been turned away from a door in his life and has therefore stopped noticing doors. "May I come in? It's cold." "No." He stopped. The smile remained, but something behind it shifted. "Evelyn, you're not coming into this house. I'm not your enemy." He said it in the voice she remembered from the early months of the engagement, warm, reasonable, the voice he'd used when he was explaining to her why she'd misunderstood something that she had actually understood perfectly. "I'm trying to give you a way out of a situation that I don't need a way out." You're working as a housekeeper in the middle of Wyoming winter for a widower you've known 2 months. He let a note of something, not pity exactly, something that wore pity as a costume, come into his voice. This is not where you belong. You don't know where I belong. I know what you deserve. He stepped up onto the porch, which she had not invited him to do, and his voice dropped to something more private, more pressured. Come back to Denver. The inquiry goes away. The stories in town go away. Everything goes away. I am offering you. You're threatening me, she said. The stories in town are yours. The inquiry is yours. You're not offering me anything you haven't manufactured. Don't stand on my employer's porch and call that an offer. Victor looked at her with the first expression she'd seen on his face since Iron Ridge that wasn't carefully managed. It was brief, a tightening around the eyes, a compression of the lips, and then it was gone, and the smile came back. But it was a different smile now. He can't fight this, Victor said. Whatever agreement he's put together with the neighbor, whatever he thinks he's documented, I have lawyers in Denver and Cheyenne who have been managing land disputes in this territory for 15 years. This will cost him more than the ranch is worth before I'm done, and we both know it. From behind her, she heard the back door open. She didn't look around. She knew Silas's footsteps well enough by now to know them from the kitchen. Victor's eyes moved past her. He looked at Silas in the doorway, the two men looking at each other across the kitchen and the length of the hallway, and every implicit claim each of them had on this particular piece of ground. And Victor's expression did something complicated, and then settled. Silas moved past Evelyn and stood on the porch beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. Mr. Ashcroft, he said. Mr. Boone. Victor's voice had returned to pleasant. He was very good at pleasant. I came to speak with Miss Harper. She's given you her answer. These matters are somewhat more complicated. The water inquiry will be contested on grounds of procedural impropriety, Silas said. It came out level, unhurried, with the authority of a man who has checked his ground before he stands on it. Harlan Price accepted payment from you to file a private claim using county land office authority. That's on record. A man from Cheyenne will be here Wednesday to review it. He paused. If you want to spend your lawyer's money on this, that's your choice. But I'd think about whether the cost is worth it, given what you're buying. Victor looked at him, then at Evelyn, then back. You've made a decision, he said to Evelyn. Not angry, studying. I made my decision in October, she said, when I left Denver. You're choosing this. He gestured at the house, the yard, the visible poverty of a working cattle ranch in December. Though what he meant by this was larger than the property, and they all knew it. Yes, she said. Victor was quiet for a moment. He looked at Silas with an expression that she couldn't entirely read, something between assessment and a grudging recalibration. And then he looked at her with something older in it, something that might once have been genuine and had been so managed and used that it barely resembled the original anymore. This isn't finished, he said. You should drive carefully on that road, Silas said. The ice patches are worse heading north. Victor descended the porch steps, got into the buggy, turned it around with some difficulty on the frozen ground, and drove back toward town. They watched him go. When he was out of the yard, Caleb appeared from around the corner of the barn, where he had apparently been stationed with a hand near the fence post in a way that was not quite casual. He looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. You can put the fence post down, she said. Caleb set it down and tried to look as if he'd been working on something. Evelyn turned back toward the house and found Silas looking at her. Not with the careful distance he'd had in the first weeks. Not with the managed courtesy of a man keeping a professional arrangement professional. With something that was direct and steady and slightly uncertain all at the same time. Are you all right? He asked. Yes. She meant it. She was not shaking, which she would have expected. She felt clear, the way the air felt clear after a hard freeze, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. He'll go back and regroup. That wasn't the end. No, Silas said, but you didn't move. She looked at him. What? When he stepped onto the porch, you didn't move back. She thought about that, about the years of learning to step back, to accommodate, to make herself smaller in whatever space he occupied. About the fact that she had not done any of those things today, not once, not even when he'd been close enough that she could smell the cold in his coat. "No," she said. "I didn't." Silas held the door for her, which was not something he usually did and which he seemed to notice was different even as he did it, and she went inside to the kitchen where Lydia was beginning the small escalating sounds that meant she had decided sleep was finished and wanted to announce that to whoever was available. Silas went to the cradle without being asked and picked up his daughter and held her with the ease that had been building for weeks now. Not perfectly, not without the slight awkwardness of a large man managing a small person, but with a naturalness that had not been there 2 months ago. Lydia grabbed his collar and oriented herself against his chest and sighed. "He'll go after the suppliers next," Evelyn said from the stove, where she was building up the fire because the confrontation had let the kitchen cool down. "If the water inquiry is compromised and I'm not leaving, he'll try to cut the ranch's market access. Spring cattle sales." "I know," Silas said. He was swaying slightly, the unconscious movement that had become his with Lydia. "Hadley's gathering. It's the right place to get ahead of it. We need to have something concrete by then, something people can see." She turned from the stove. "Not just us saying Victor's campaign is dishonest. Evidence. The man from Cheyenne gets here Wednesday. Then Wednesday matters." Silas looked at her over the top of Lydia's head. Something in the lamplight, the way the kitchen was lit in winter evenings, close and amber and ordinary, made everything slightly more visible than the clear-eyed daylight usually allowed. And what she could see in his face right now was a man who had spent 6 months in a house that was full of absence, who had woken up one morning to find it less empty than it had been, and who had not yet entirely reckoned with what that meant. She had not entirely reckoned with it either. "Thank you," she said, "for coming in from the pasture." "Caleb was white as a sheet when he got to me," Silas said. "I ran most of the way back." She looked at him, at the fact of him, in this kitchen, holding his daughter, having run across a frozen pasture. "I know," she said quietly. He looked back. Outside, the wind had come up, and the last light was leaving the sky, and the ranch was exactly what it had always been. Imperfect, demanding, too cold, too much work, and neither of them said anything else. And that was enough. The man from Cheyenne arrived on Wednesday as promised, which was the first thing that had gone exactly as planned in 3 weeks, and Evelyn took it as a sign of nothing except that occasionally things went as planned. His name was Edmund Rourke, and he was not what she'd expected. She had constructed, without meaning to, the image of someone lawyerly, precise, formal, the kind of man who kept his coat buttoned in cold weather as a matter of professional pride. Edmund Rourke was 55, heavy-set, with a graying beard he hadn't trimmed recently, and the permanently ink-stained fingers of someone who spent more time with documents than with people. He arrived on horseback, which surprised her, and he came into the kitchen and accepted coffee before he said anything substantive and looked around the house with the quiet assessment of a man cataloging details for future reference. "Silas said you knew about the price filing," he said to Evelyn, after the coffee had been poured and Silas had come in from outside. "I knew it existed. I don't know the procedural specifics." "The procedural specifics are interesting." Rourke set down his cup. Price filed the inquiry using a county land authority form that's specifically designated for boundary disputes between adjacent landowners. Victor Ashcroft doesn't own adjacent land. He doesn't own any land in this county. He's a private citizen from Colorado who paid a county official to file a claim on his behalf using a form he had no legal standing to use. Silas leaned against the counter. Can that be challenged? It can be more than challenged. It can be invalidated and referred to the county commissioner as a conduct matter against Price. Rourke opened the leather case he'd set on the table. "I pulled the original filing, the payment record from the land office ledger. Price records his fees, which is usually good practice, and in this case is going to be very inconvenient for him, and the statutory language on the form itself." He laid 3 documents on the table. "If you want to fight this, you have the ammunition. The question is whether you want to make it public, which will cost Price his position and might make Ashcroft dig in harder, or keep it as leverage." Evelyn looked at the documents. Then she looked at Silas. "What does digging in harder look like from Ashcroft?" More money, Silas said. More lawyers, more time. And leverage means he knows we have it, but the town doesn't. Correct, Rourke said, watching her. She thought about Victor on the porch, about the way he'd said this isn't finished, about the Coulter Ranch 2 towns east, sold for a third of its value after 8 months of Victor's patient, methodical destruction of everything around it. Make it public, she said. Both men looked at her. He doesn't respond to leverage, she said. I know him. Leverage is a negotiation, and he's good at negotiations. What he can't manage is losing the appearance of legitimacy in front of people whose opinion matters to his business interests. She kept her voice level because the clarity of it required levelness. If the town knows that Harlan Price filed an illegal claim on behalf of an outside businessman, 2 things happen. Price loses authority in the land office, which means Victor loses his inside position. And the story about what Victor is actually doing here stops being rumor and becomes record. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Silas. She's right. I know she is, Silas said. He had the expression she'd come to associate with decisions being finalized. The slight settling of the face, the quality of a man who has examined a thing from all sides and is now done examining. How do we document it formally? I draft a formal objection to the filing citing the procedural violation. You sign it. We file it with the county commissioner in Laramie, not through Price, and simultaneously send a copy to the Iron Ridge post office for public record. Rourke paused. Timing matters. You want this to land before Ashcroft can prepare a counter. The Hadley gathering is in 8 days, Evelyn said. Rourke looked at her again with the same quality Tom Hadley had on the street, the look of someone revising a prior estimate. 8 days is enough, he said. I'll draft it tonight. Well, the document went out Thursday morning, carried by Rourke himself on the road to Laramie. Silas watched the horse disappear down the frozen track toward the main road and stood in the yard for a moment in the cold, and Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window. The set of his shoulders, the stillness of a man who has committed to a direction and is now waiting for the ground to show him whether it was solid. She turned back to the bread she was making. Lydia was in the cradle nearby, batting at the wooden toy Caleb had carved for her, inexpertly, with considerable enthusiasm and a result that was more conceptual than precise. And the kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and rising dough and coffee. It was the most ordinary possible morning. The contrast between this, the dailiness of it, the warmth, and the thing moving through the county mail on its way to Laramie was almost disorienting. Silas came in and went directly to the coffee pot without speaking, which meant he was still inside the decision and hadn't come out the other side yet. She let him be. She had learned when he needed space and when he needed someone to talk to, and the difference was in how he moved. Purposeful silence meant he was thinking, and directionless movement meant he wanted to stop. He poured the coffee and stood at the window she'd just been at, looking out at the yard. If this doesn't work, he said, it will work. If it doesn't, Silas. She said his name the way she'd been saying it for 3 weeks now, since the morning she'd used it without planning to. Just his name, no title, no qualifier. We have the filing record and the statutory violation and Rourke's documentation and Abe's boundary agreement. That's more than he came here with. Stop finding the version where it goes wrong. He turned from the window. I'm not finding it. I'm preparing for it. There's a difference? For a rancher, yes. He sat down at the table, which meant the purposeful silence had run its course. You plan for bad weather not because you think it's coming, but because the cost of not planning is higher than the cost of being wrong. She dusted flour from her hands. Then plan for it. But plan from what we actually have, not from the worst version of what we don't know yet. She sat across from him. What do you need to have in place if the filing doesn't move fast enough before the gathering? He thought about it with the seriousness she'd come to respect, the unsentimental way he looked at problems. The cattle sales, he said. If Ashcroft goes after the spring market relationships before Hadley's gathering gives us a chance to stabilize them. Hadley is the anchor. If Hadley holds, most of the northern county holds. But there are 2 buyers in the southern end who don't know me as well and who will be more susceptible to whatever Ashcroft is circulating. Can you reach them before the gathering? I can ride to Ellison. That's the nearer one. Day after tomorrow. Kendrick, the further one, would take a letter. He paused. I've been thinking about the grazing agreement. Tell me. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. There are 4 ranches north of the ridge that share a grazing rotation every 3 years. The arrangement is informal, handshake mostly. Ashcroft has been talking to at least 2 of those ranchers based on what Caleb's been hearing. I don't know what he's offering them. Something that makes them feel like siding with him is safer than siding with you. Probably money. Access to Denver markets he has connections to. He paused. If I formalize the grazing rotation, put it on paper, include terms that make the arrangement worth more to each ranch than whatever Ashcroft is offering as a side deal, it removes the option he's dangling. Evelyn looked at him. How much land would you have to commit? More than I'd want to. He said it straight, no attempt to soften it. The North Pasture, part of the Ridge grazing rights. It would be a real commitment, not a gesture. But it saves the other ranches from a deal that benefits Ashcroft. And it makes the grazing rotation something with legal standing, which means Ashcroft can't simply buy one rancher's land and dissolve the arrangement. He stopped. It's a risk. So is the alternative. Yes. She looked at him across the table and thought about the man she'd met 11 weeks ago. The man who'd stood in his doorway watching her cross his yard with the careful guardedness of someone who had decided that letting things in was how you lost them. He was still that man. That hadn't gone anywhere. But underneath it something had changed, the way the land changes in late winter when the frost is still on the surface but the ground has started to move. The gathering, she said. You announced the grazing agreement there, in front of everyone, including whoever Ashcroft has been working on. Public commitment, public record. Silas looked at her. He wants to isolate you, she said. The grazing agreement is the opposite of isolation. You make Boone Ranch the center of something that benefits everyone around it. That's not a target. That's a foundation. Another silence. Outside, Caleb's voice said something to one of the horses, and the horse made a sound that was probably skeptical. You think like a strategist, Silas said. Not admiringly, exactly. He wasn't a man who said things purely for effect, more like a fact being added to a file. I think like a woman who spent 2 years watching Victor Ashcroft move pieces, she said. You learn how the game goes. He was quiet for a moment, then, the gathering is 8 days. I'll ride to Ellison on Friday, write to Kendrick tonight, and spend the time between now and the gathering drafting the grazing terms with Abe. He stood. And I need you there. At the gathering, not as the housekeeper. She looked up at him. He was standing at the table and there was something slightly awkward in him. In the way he held himself, in the way he was looking at a point just past her left shoulder rather than directly at her, that told her this was something he'd been building toward and had only just found the words for. I mean, he stopped, started again. The way it needs to look, the way it needs to be. You're part of this ranch. People need to see that. Not a temporary arrangement, not someone who's passing through. He finally looked at her directly, and whatever it had cost him to say that was visible for just a moment before he put it back behind the careful face. If you want that to be true. The kitchen was very quiet. Lydia had abandoned the wooden toy and was asleep again, the way she dropped off sometimes in the middle of the afternoon. Suddenly, completely, like a lamp being turned down. It's already true, Evelyn said. She said it simply, without making more of it than it was yet, because it was still something delicate, and she was a careful person with delicate things. It's been true for a while. Silas nodded once. Then he picked up his coat. I'll be in the barn, he said, and went. And she let him go and turned back to the bread, and the kitchen held the warmth of the fire, and the weight of what had just been said, and the ordinary persistent sound of life going on. Victor made his next move on a Sunday, 5 days before the gathering, and he made it directly rather than through the indirect channels he'd been using, which told Evelyn that Rourke's filing had reached the right ears, and the indirect channels were starting to cost more than they were returning. He came to the gathering of ranchers that met informally at the south end of town every Sunday after the noon meal. A loose, habitual thing, more social than formal, where the men of the county talked livestock prices and weather and the business of the land. Silas went every week and had stopped mentioning it, because it was as much a part of the weekly rhythm as anything else. Evelyn knew about it from Caleb, who had been twice and reported that it was mostly standing in the cold talking about cattle in language he was still learning. This Sunday, Victor Ashcroft attended. Silas came home 2 hours later with the particular quality of controlled anger that she recognized by now. Tight around the jaw, moving through the kitchen without unnecessary motion, putting his coat on the hook with more precision than usual. He proposed a water consortium, Silas said. He poured himself water, not coffee, which meant his hands needed something to do. 6 ranches, pooled water rights, centralized management. He'd provide the capital for infrastructure improvements, reservoirs, redirected creek lines, a pump system for the winter months. Evelyn sat down. And in exchange, 20% ownership stake in each ranch's water infrastructure, held by his company in Denver. He drank the water and set the glass down. He laid it out very professionally, maps, cost projections, a formal proposal printed on good paper. A pause. 3 of the 6 ranchers in the room looked interested. Which 3? Barrow, Felch, and Pete Monroe. He turned and looked at her. Barrow and Felch are both in the northern grazing rotation. Monroe isn't, but he has the best water position of anyone in the county, and if he sells a stake to Ashcroft's company, then Ashcroft controls a piece of the water network regardless of what happens with your filing, she said. He doesn't need Boone Ranch's water rights specifically. He needs enough of the regional water to make himself indispensable. And then what he does with that indispensability is leverage, she said, over everyone, not just you. She was quiet for a moment. He's lost the straightforward approach. Now he's building something bigger that makes us just one part of a larger problem. Silas sat down. He looked tired in a way that went past the physical, the particular tiredness of a man who has been managing a threat that keeps changing shape. What did you say to the 3 who looked interested? She asked. I said the proposal deserved careful reading before any commitments. He rubbed the back of his neck. I couldn't say more without more information. That was right. It didn't feel right. I know, but walking into it without information would have been worse. She thought for a moment. The grazing agreement, the one you're drafting with Abe, can it include a water provision? Not just grazing rotation, but a shared commitment to maintain existing water access as it stands, without external ownership stakes? He looked at her slowly. If each ranch signs it, it's a prior commitment. Ashcroft's consortium would have to work around it. More than that, it's a community decision, made before he made his pitch. If people sign the grazing agreement at the gathering and the water provision is in it, then accepting his consortium means breaking an agreement with their neighbors. That's a different calculation than just weighing his proposal on its merits. Silas was looking at her with the expression that she now knew was not surprise exactly, but a cousin of it. The look of someone who has heard their own reasoning spoken back more clearly than they'd managed internally. I need to get the water language into the draft before the gathering, he said. You have 5 days. Abe needs to agree to it. Abe Torrance told Victor to get off his fence line last week, Evelyn said. I heard that from Marta. I think Abe will agree to it. Silas almost smiled. Not quite. He was still not a man who smiled easily. But the corners of his mouth moved. I'll ride to Abe's tomorrow. Take the revised draft with you. He looked at her. I haven't written a revised draft. You will tonight, she said. I'll help. They sat at the kitchen table after supper with Lydia asleep in the cradle and the fire banked and a lamp between them casting yellow light on paper, and they worked through the language of the grazing agreement for 2 hours. Silas knowing the land and the livestock terms and the practical specifics, Evelyn knowing the structure of legal language from 2 years of reading everything Victor had ever had drawn up, and understanding that what you left out was as important as what you included. It was slow work and imprecise work, and at one point they argued for 15 minutes about the definition of existing water access, before arriving at language that was precise enough to hold in court and plain enough that Tom Hadley would sign it without calling his own lawyer first. At some point during the second hour, the lamp between them meant they were working close, shoulders not quite touching, her handwriting filling in words while he spoke them, his hand occasionally reaching past hers to point at a clause. And it was the most natural thing in the world, and also not natural at all, in the way that things are when they have become familiar before you were ready for them to be familiar. At 10 o'clock, she put her pen down and said, That's the best version we're going to get tonight. He read back through it once, slowly, the way he read everything. Then he put it down and looked at her. When this is over, he said. She waited. I mean, after the gathering, after the filing and the price situation, and whatever Ashcroft does next. He stopped, looked at the document, looked at her. I'd like to have a conversation that isn't about any of that. She looked at him in the lamplight, at this man who had lost his wife and nearly lost himself, and was sitting in his kitchen at 10 at night drafting a legal document he'd never planned to need because someone had come to his door with one suitcase and a lot of problems, and he'd decided somewhere along the way that her problems were also his. So would I, she said. He nodded once, with the careful gravity of a man making a note of something important. Then he gathered the documents and stood. Get some sleep, he said. Lydia's been sleeping 4 hours. She'll be up soon. I know her patterns, Evelyn said. I know you know. He paused at the kitchen doorway. He stopped, made a small motion with his hand that was not dismissive, but was the gesture of a man who has said something and doesn't know how to follow it. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, she said. She sat at the table for a moment after he'd gone, listening to the house settle around her. The fire, the wind, the small sounds of Lydia's breathing, and thought about the conversation they would have after. The gathering at Hadley's ranch was on a Thursday, and the weather, for the first time in weeks, cooperated. The temperature climbed to 28 degrees, which was not warm but was workable, and the sky was clear enough that the light had an edge to it, a brightness off the snow that made everything look sharper than usual. Evelyn wore her best dress, which was not much, deep green wool, well-made but 3 years old, pressed the night before with a care she didn't usually give to ranch clothing. Silas, she noticed when he came into the kitchen that morning, had shaved, which he did every 3 or 4 days, and never on any particular occasion, and she understood without comment that he'd decided this morning was specific. Caleb stayed at the ranch with Lydia, a responsibility he accepted with the seriousness of someone who understood that being trusted with an infant was not a minor thing. Evelyn had left him with 4 pages of notes, which he'd read with visible concentration, and then looked up and said, I know how to hold a baby, in a tone of mild offense. I know you do, she said. The notes are for the edge cases. What's an edge case? You'll know it when it happens. They drove to Hadley's, both Silas and Evelyn on the wagon bench in the clear winter morning, and the 4 miles felt different from every other time she'd made them. She had made this drive in storms and cold, and once in the dark when Silas had needed her in town and she'd driven herself without particular incident. This was different, not because of what was at stake, though that was real, different because of what he'd said at the kitchen table, the conversation that would come after, and because she could feel him aware of her presence beside him in a way that was not new but was more evident than it had been. They didn't talk much on the drive. They didn't need to. The Hadley Ranch was larger than Boone Ranch and showed it. A main house with a proper porch, a barn that could hold 30 horses, and on this Thursday morning a yard full of wagons and horses and the sound of a dozen conversations running simultaneously. Evelyn counted 9 ranchers she recognized, and several she didn't, plus wives, plus children running between legs, with the particular freedom of children who have been released from confined quarters into a large space. Tom Hadley met them in the yard with his wife, a broad-shouldered woman named Clara, who shook Evelyn's hand with the directness of someone who has decided that an opinion formed from rumor is not an opinion worth having. Miss Harper, Clara said, I've heard enough about you to form a complete picture without any of the parts being reliable. I'm going to start from scratch if that's acceptable. Very acceptable, Evelyn said, and Clara Hadley smiled, a real one, the kind with enough history behind it that it reached all the way, and took her arm and walked her inside. What happened in the next 2 hours was not a confrontation, which was what she'd been half-braced for. It was quieter and more durable than that. It was the accumulation of small interactions, conversations about the winter, about cattle, about the grazing land and the water question and the kind of spring they were likely to get, in which Evelyn was simply present and simply herself, and the women of the county, who paid attention to different things than their husbands did, drew their own conclusions. Silas presented the revised grazing agreement with the water provision after the midday meal, when the ranchers had gathered in the main room with coffee and were prepared to talk business. He explained it plainly, without oratory, in the direct language of a man who was describing something practical. What it was, what it committed each ranch to, what it protected. Then he said, Victor Ashcroft has made a proposal for a water consortium. You've probably heard of it, or will. The proposal involves an outside company holding ownership stakes in your water infrastructure. I'm not telling you what to decide about that, but if you want an alternative, a framework that keeps the water arrangements between neighbors with no outside ownership, this is it. The room was quiet for a moment. Tom Hadley, sitting in the chair nearest the fire, with his arms folded and the settled air of a man who has already made his decision, said, What are the signing ranches? So far, myself and Abe Torrance. I'm hoping for more today. 3 others told me they were considering Ashcroft's consortium, Hadley said. I don't know their position now. From the far side of the room, a man Evelyn recognized as one of the northern grazing ranchers. Barrow, who had been one of the 3 Silas had named as looking interested at Sunday's meeting, said, The consortium proposal had numbers that looked good on paper. Paper's where good numbers tend to live, Abe Torrance said from his seat, with the dry delivery of a man who had heard a great many good numbers in his 62 years. A brief, real laugh ran through the room. The particular laugh of a group of people who know each other well enough to find the same thing funny in the same way. Barrow wasn't offended. He was thinking, if the water provision holds against outside claims, it's written to hold, Silas said. Edmund Rourke reviewed the language. Rourke's name carried weight in the county. She hadn't known that, but could see it in how several faces shifted at the mention. That was what Silas had understood in writing to him, and what she'd understood in supporting it. This was not just about law. It was about who vouched for what. By the end of the afternoon, 5 ranchers had signed. Barrow was one of them. Felch was not, which was a loss but not a catastrophic one. Monroe, the rancher with the best water position in the county, sat with the document for 20 minutes and then signed it without saying anything, which in Evelyn's experience of men who expressed themselves primarily through action was the most emphatic yes available. She was in the kitchen with Clara Hadley, helping clear the dishes, when Clara said quietly, "The businessman at the Douglas Hotel. He came to see me last week." Evelyn set down the plate she was holding. "He came to my house," Clara said, "without Tom, while Tom was out. He brought a very nice bottle of whiskey, which I didn't take, and he told me that the woman working for Silas Boone had a history of financial dishonesty. He used that exact phrase, financial dishonesty. He implied there were records." Evelyn kept her face still. "I told him," Clara said, "that in 30 years of marriage, Tom and I had learned to tell the difference between a man who comes to your door with information and a man who comes to your door with a purpose. And his purpose was not difficult to identify." She picked up her own stack of dishes. "I told him to leave, and he did. But I wanted you to know he'd tried." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Don't thank me. The records he mentioned, are they real?" "No," Evelyn said. "They don't exist. He would manufacture them if he needed to. He hasn't needed to yet." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Can he?" "He can create very convincing forgeries if he has enough time and the right people. He's done it before." She said it without looking away from the dishes. "That's why the county commissioner filing matters. Once Price's conduct is on record, anything else Ashcroft introduces through unofficial channels gets questioned." Clara looked at her for a moment. "You know this man very well." "Too well," Evelyn said, "and not well enough, probably. The part of him I never fully understood was how far he'd go. I thought I knew, and I was wrong about the upper limit." Clara nodded slowly. "Well," she said, "Tom signed the agreement. That means something in this county." She handed Evelyn a dish towel. "Dry these." They dried dishes in the winter afternoon kitchen of the Hadley Ranch, and outside through the window Evelyn could see Silas in the yard, talking to Monroe, and from the angle of Monroe's shoulders, and the way he was nodding, she thought it was going the right way. Not perfectly, not without cost, but the right way. 5 signatures. Price's filing documented and challenged. Rourke on his way back to Cheyenne with the formal record. And Victor Ashcroft somewhere in Iron Ridge, at the Douglas Hotel probably, because that was where men like him went when their plans were running behind schedule, to sit in comfort and revise. She thought about what revision looked like for Victor. She thought about the upper limit she'd mentioned to Clara, the part of him she'd always been uncertain about. She had never seen him lose before. She had only seen him win and seen him adjust and seen him refuse to accept the word no from anyone who had ever said it to him. What she had not seen was what happened when both the legal approach and the social approach failed at the same time in a community that had turned toward rather than away. She was about to find out. What? The answer came 4 days later, and it came not as a legal filing or a rumor or a visit to someone's house with a bottle of whiskey, but as a simple physical fact, someone had blocked the upper tributary of the East Creek. Caleb found it on a Monday morning. He'd gone to check the cattle in the lower pasture and found the main trough running at a third of its normal volume, and followed the tributary upstream for a quarter mile until he found the obstruction. Not a natural blockage, not ice, but a deliberate redirection using materials that had been carried in from somewhere else. The kind of work that took 2 men and several hours and had been done in the night. He came back and told Silas, and Silas came back and told Evelyn, and the 3 of them stood in the kitchen at 8 in the morning with the information sitting on the table between them like something that needed to be handled carefully. "He's done with the paperwork," Silas said. "This is the direct move." "Can the blockage be removed?" Evelyn asked. "Yes. Caleb and I can do it in 2 hours." He paused. "That's not the point." "No," she agreed. "The point is he's now damaged physical property, which is not a land filing question. It's a criminal one." She thought for a moment. "Who's the county sheriff?" "Dale Morse. He's in Laramie most weeks. His deputy's here." "The deputy? Is he the one I've seen talking to Victor?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Yes." "Then we skip the deputy and we send for Morse directly." She looked at Caleb. "Did you touch anything at the blockage?" "No, ma'am." "Good. Don't. Not until we have a witness." She looked at Silas. "Abe Torrance. He's the adjacent landowner. If he rides out with you to the blockage before you clear it, you have a witness with standing. Someone who signed the boundary agreement and can speak to the water flow history." Silas was already reaching for his coat. "I'll go to Abe first." "Take Caleb. I'll write to Sheriff Morse." He was at the door when she said, "Silas?" He stopped. "This is the last thing he has," she said. "If this doesn't work, if this gets documented and referred to Morse and the county understands what he did, he has nothing left in this county that isn't compromised. He'll know that." She held his gaze. "Which means when you come back, we may be in the last conversation with him, and I need you to let me handle it." A long pause. "Evelyn, I know him," she said. "You know the land. Let me handle the conversation." He looked at her for a moment. This man who had spent 6 months not letting anyone handle anything, and said, "All right." He went. She sat down and wrote the clearest, most precise letter she had written in years. And outside the window, the January sky was hard and bright and entirely indifferent. And somewhere in Iron Ridge, Victor Ashcroft was waiting to see if the last move had worked, and she addressed the envelope to Sheriff Dale Morse, Laramie, Wyoming, and pressed the seal closed, and was not afraid. Sheriff Dale Morse arrived from Laramie on a Wednesday, 2 days after Evelyn's letter had gone out, and he was not what the deputy's presence in Iron Ridge had led her to expect from the county's law enforcement. Morse was 60, lean in the way that came from decades of outdoor work rather than intention, with a gray mustache and the unhurried quality of a man who had seen enough urgency in his career to know which situations actually required it and which only felt that way. He came to Boone Ranch first, before going to the land office or the Douglas Hotel, which told Evelyn something about how he'd read her letter. He looked at the documented blockage, Abe Torrance's written account, Caleb's account, the physical evidence that Silas and Abe had photographed in the only way available to them, which was a hand-drawn diagram of the obstruction's construction with measurements. And he read Rourke's filing documentation on Price, and he drank 1 cup of coffee without commenting on any of it until he was done. Then he said, "The blockage materials, where did they come from?" "Not from this property," Silas said. "Not from Abe's. The timber cuts are from a different kind of tree than what grows on either boundary. Someone brought them in the night. Probably 2 men, maybe 3. Morse set down the cup. "Ashcroft has 2 men staying with him at the Douglas. Arrived a week ago. Said they were business associates." He looked at the documents again, not at any one of them in particular, just looking at the pile of it. "This is a lot of paper for a water dispute." "It's not a water dispute," Evelyn said. "It's a campaign. The water is the current move. Before that it was the land filing. Before that it was reputation. Before that it was supplier relationships." She said it plainly, not with heat. He works in sequence. Each piece is designed to weaken the position before the next piece arrives. Morse looked at her. "You know this man." "I was engaged to him for 8 months." A pause. "I see." He looked at Silas. "The creek's running again?" "Since Monday afternoon. We couldn't leave the cattle without water." "No, you couldn't." He stood, put his hat on. "I'll go speak with Mr. Ashcroft. I'll speak with Price too, separately. And my deputy—" He said the words with a flatness that contained an entire disciplinary conversation Evelyn was not going to be present for. "My deputy will be reassigned to Laramie for the remainder of this situation." Silas nodded. Morse looked at the documents one more time. "Miss Harper, is there anything else I should know before I walk into that hotel?" She thought about it carefully, about Victor and the way he presented, the good coat, the reasonable voice, the way he made disorder look like concern and aggression look like business. "He'll be cooperative," she said. "He'll have answers for everything. The men staying with him were here for legitimate business purposes. The blockage was nothing to do with him. The price filing was a good faith inquiry by a private citizen. He'll have a version of every piece of this that sounds plausible." She paused. "The thing that won't be plausible is the sum of it. Ask him to explain not each piece, but why all of these things happened in the same town at the same time to the same person." Morse looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but its structural predecessor. "Good advice," he said, and went. Victor came to the ranch that afternoon. She had known he would. Morse's visit would have told him that the situation had moved past the phase where managing it quietly was possible. And Victor's response to that, she knew this because she had watched it once before, with Coulter, from the outside, was a final direct conversation. A last attempt to reshape the thing before it became permanent record. He came alone this time, without the pretense of pleasantness in the approach. He knocked instead of announcing himself, which was a small concession to the changed situation, and when she opened the door he was standing on the porch in his good coat, with his hands at his sides and the look of a man who has revised downward what he expects to get from the next hour. "May I come in?" he said. Not a question exactly, not the assumption of before. "No," she said. "We can talk here." He accepted that. He looked past her once, briefly, and she knew he was checking for Silas, and she said, "He's here. He's staying inside unless I ask him to come out." "You planned this." "I told him I'd handle the conversation." She stepped onto the porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. The cold hit immediately. She didn't reach back for a coat. "The sheriff has your men's accounts of Monday night. They don't match each other in 3 specific details, which means one of them or both of them adjusted the truth somewhere, and the adjustment wasn't coordinated well enough." Victor's expression didn't change. He was very good at that. "I don't know what my associates were doing Monday night." "That's what you'll say to Morse. I'm not interested in what you'll say to Morse." She looked at him directly. "I want to know if you actually believe at this point that there's a version of this that ends the way you planned it." A silence. The wind moved between them. "You could still come back," he said. He said it differently than he'd said it on the porch the first time, without the pleasantness, without the managed warmth. Just a statement stripped down to its actual meaning. The filing goes away. The legal question goes away. Everything is resolved. "I know," she said. "That's not what I asked you." He looked at her. Really looked. The way he almost never did. Not inventory, not assessment, but something older and less strategic. She had seen it once before, the night she'd told him she was leaving, for approximately 4 seconds before he'd replaced it with the managed version. "No," he said, quietly. "I don't think there's a version of this that ends how I planned it." "Then why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer, whatever it was, moved across his face and didn't quite make it to words. What she thought it was, what she had suspected since the second letter that didn't come but the man himself did, was that Victor Ashcroft had, buried under 2 years of management and strategy, and the habit of treating people as positions to be acquired, something that had originally been real. It had become unrecognizable under everything he'd built on top of it. But the original thing was in there somewhere, and it was the reason he'd followed her to Wyoming when a rational calculation would have said the cost was too high. That didn't make what he'd done acceptable. It didn't balance anything. But she understood it, and understanding it made her able to say what came next without cruelty. "You should go home, Victor," she said. "Not because you've lost, though you have, because staying is making it worse for everyone, including you." He looked at the yard. At the fence line, the barn, the visible evidence of a working operation that had held together through everything he'd thrown at it. "You chose this," he said. The same words as before, the same gesture at the ranch, but this time without the contempt that had been underneath it. "I chose this," she said. Victor stopped. Whatever he was going to say about Silas, he seemed to decide was not worth saying. He looked at her once more. "You were always better at this than I gave you credit for." "At what?" "Knowing what you wanted." He said it without bitterness. That was the most surprising thing, that at the end of it, stripped of leverage and strategy, what remained in Victor Ashcroft was something that could, at least for a moment, say a true thing without a purpose behind it. "Goodbye, Victor," she said. He descended the porch steps, got into the buggy, and drove back toward Iron Ridge. She stood on the porch and watched him go and did not feel triumphant, because it had cost too much along the way for triumph to be the right word. What she felt was the particular exhaustion and clarity of someone who has carried a weight for a long time and has just put it down. The door opened behind her. Silas came out and stood beside her. He didn't ask how it had gone. He could see the buggy at the end of the track, and he could see her face, and he was a man who understood that some resolutions were too complicated for immediate summary. They stood on the porch together in the January cold and watched the buggy disappear around the bend, and then he said, "Come inside. It's freezing." "I know," she said, and she went in. Eesh. Harlan Price resigned from the land office the following week, before the county commissioner's inquiry concluded. He submitted his resignation in writing, which Marta Feld reported with the satisfied brevity of someone for whom the filing represented something beyond its immediate significance. A small proof that record-keeping mattered, that what was documented persisted where what was merely said dissolved. Victor's 2 associates left Iron Ridge the day after Morse's formal interview. Victor himself left the day after that, on a Thursday morning, in a hired coach to the Laramie station. Maine saw him go. He reported it to Silas without drama. The businessman from Denver had checked out, had his luggage loaded, and had not said goodbye to anyone that anyone knew of. The water inquiry was formally dismissed 2 weeks later, the filing declared procedurally invalid on the grounds Rourke had cited. It would not generate a lien, a claim, or any lasting mark on the property record of Boone Ranch. It would appear in the county commissioner's report as an example of process misuse, and Price's name would appear there too, and that was the shape that accountability took in this particular place and time. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way that stories sometimes made justice look, but real, documented, permanent. The grazing agreement held. All 5 signatures remained. Monroe, the rancher whose water position had made him the most valuable piece of the puzzle, told Silas in February that he'd received a follow-up letter from Ashcroft's Denver office proposing a modified version of the consortium without the ownership stakes. He'd sent a 1-sentence reply declining. He showed Silas the letter and the reply with the air of a man displaying something that had amused him, and Silas brought the story home to Evelyn that evening, and she laughed, really laughed. The kind that came from somewhere deep and surprised. that she hadn't heard herself make since before Denver. Silas looked at her when she laughed. The look was not complicated. It was a man watching something he valued, plainly, without trying to be subtle about it. The conversation he'd mentioned at the kitchen table, the one that wasn't about any of it, happened on a Saturday in late January, and it happened the way real things happened between real people, which is to say, not in the clean shape of intention, but in the sideways shape of a moment that arrived before either of them had finished preparing for it. She was mending a shirt, his, one of the three that got actual use, and he was at the table with the ranch ledger, which he checked on Saturdays with the regularity of a man who understood that the numbers were not interesting, but the alternative to knowing them was worse. Lydia was on the floor on a blanket, which she had recently begun to regard as insufficient containment, pushing up onto her arms and regarding the room with the intent focus of someone scouting terrain. The fire was good. The lamp was lit. Outside it had started snowing again, the quiet kind, not the hammering kind, and the sound of it against the windows was the sound of something peaceful. "I keep thinking about what you said," Silas said. He was looking at the ledger, but not, she thought, reading it. "Which thing?" "On the porch. After he left." He paused. "You said you chose this." "I did." "Did you mean—" He stopped, set down his pen, looked at the window instead of her, which was his version of finding his way toward something. "Did you mean the position, the job?" She set down the shirt. "No," she said. "I didn't mean the job." He turned and looked at her then, and the lamp was between them the way it had been when they'd worked on the grazing document, and his face in that light was the face of a man who had been alone inside himself for a long time and had slowly, reluctantly, gratefully stopped being alone, and was looking at the person responsible for that with an expression that he wasn't bothering to manage. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I should say that first. I was married for 4 years, and I loved my wife, and when she died, I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought that was the only version of that for me, that it had happened and it was done." "I know," she said. "I'm not smooth about this. I'm not going to be. I'm not asking you to be." He looked at her for a moment. "What are you asking?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. Not what sounded right, not what was safe, but what was true. "I'm asking you to not disappear back behind that door," she said. "I'm not asking for promises or plans or anything that has a shape yet. I'm asking you to stay in the same room." He was quiet for a long moment. Lydia, on the blanket, made a sound of sudden discovery, and both of them looked at her. She had found her own feet, had grabbed her right foot with both hands, and was staring at it with the profound wonder of someone encountering for the first time a thing that had always been there. "She's going to be insufferable," Silas said quietly. "Once she figures out she can move." "She already knows she can move," Evelyn said. "She's just making sure." He almost smiled. Then it became an actual smile, full, unmanaged, the first one she had seen from him that wasn't partial or restrained, and it changed his face completely, the way a window changes a room when you open it. She thought she would remember that smile specifically for a long time, because of how much it cost him and how freely he gave it. "I'll stay in the same room," he said. Botan. They married in the second week of February, which was not planned in advance so much as arrived at, the way some things arrive, through the accumulation of days that had made the question less a decision than a recognition. It was not a large event. Silas was not a man built for large events, and Evelyn had stopped needing ceremonies to prove things to herself sometime around the second month in Wyoming. Marta Feld served as witness. Abe Torrance came, and Tom and Clara Hadley, and Caleb, who stood in his good shirt looking like someone attending the most important meeting of his professional career. The justice of the peace who conducted it was a small man named Gibbs, who had the practical warmth of someone who had presided over enough frontier weddings to have lost the formality and kept only the genuine. He spoke briefly and plainly, and when it was done, he shook Silas's hand and told Evelyn she'd done well, which she thought was both slightly presumptuous and not entirely wrong. Lydia, 6 months old and recently in command of her ability to sit unsupported, sat on Clara Hadley's lap throughout and observed the proceedings with the grave attention she gave to most human activities, as if filing it for later reference. Afterward, there was food in the Hadley kitchen, which Clara had organized with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and there was coffee and something stronger, and there was the sound of people who had been through something hard together, eating and talking and being alive in the ordinary way that is not ordinary at all, when you have recently understood how fragile it is. Caleb, at some point in the evening, appeared at Evelyn's elbow with the careful approach of someone who has been working up to a thing. "I wanted to say," he started. She waited. "When I got here in December," he said, "the ranch was, Mr. Boone was—" He seemed to be searching for language that was honest without being unkind. "It was a quiet house." "I know," she said. "It's not quiet now." He said it with the straight-faced simplicity of someone reporting a fact. "I just wanted to say that's because of you. Mostly." She looked at him, this 19-year-old boy who had shown up to work on a cattle ranch and had instead found himself in the middle of something much larger than fence mending. And she felt something that was not quite maternal and not quite sisterly, but was in the vicinity of both. "You stayed," she said, "through all of it. That mattered." He went red to the ears and found somewhere else to be, and she let him go. Silas appeared at her side a few minutes later in the particular way he'd developed of knowing where she was in a room without appearing to track it. "Caleb said something," he said. "He did." "He went red." "He did." Silas looked across the room to where Caleb was talking to Abe Torrance with considerably more composure than he'd managed with Evelyn. "He's a good hand," Silas said. "Better than he thinks he is." "Most people are," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Is that a general observation?" "It's a specific one, mostly." He was quiet for a moment, and then he took her hand, straightforwardly, without making anything of it, just her hand in his at their side, in a room full of people who had come out in February in Wyoming to mark something worth marking. His hand was large and calloused and warm and slightly uncertain in its grip, as if he wasn't sure yet of the right amount of hold, and that uncertainty was more honest and more right than any amount of certainty would have been. Tip. The snow that had started Saturday night continued through Sunday and into Monday, and by Tuesday, Boone Ranch was buried under 14 inches of February white, and the cattle were in the lower pasture and the water was running at full volume through the East Creek, and Caleb was in the barn singing something off-key to the horses, who appeared to tolerate it. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with Lydia on her hip, 7 months old now, heavier every week, interested in the window glass and the snow beyond it with the focused intensity of someone studying a foreign country, and watched the yard and the fence line and the ridge beyond, which was white and solid against a sky that had cleared overnight to something clear and cold and achingly bright. She thought about the woman who had stood outside the Iron Ridge post office in November with a suitcase and a reasonable amount of dread. That woman had believed, in the way you believe things that have been proved to you repeatedly, that the next place would be like the last place, and the place before that? Somewhere she could make herself useful and could not quite make herself belong. She had been wrong about that. Not because someone had decided she belonged, not because she had been rescued from the pattern of not belonging, or chosen by someone in a way that negated it. She had been wrong because belonging was not, it turned out, a quality that places or people conferred. It was a quality you built, the way you built anything on the frontier, with daily work and imperfect materials and the willingness to stay when staying was hard, and to repair what broke, and to be honest about what you couldn't fix and find a different way around it. She had not fixed Silas Boone. He was still the man who went quiet when he was troubled and needed space to think before he could talk, and would spend the rest of his life occasionally standing at windows in the early morning, not saying anything. She had not fixed the grief in him. The grief was still there. It would always be there, in the particular shape that real things leave when they pass through a person, not as damage, exactly, but as history, something that had happened and had not unhappened. And she was still the woman who had spent 2 years shrinking herself to fit a space that was never going to be the right shape. She was still someone who sometimes moved too fast toward a solution before she'd finished feeling the problem, who found it easier to repair a door hinge than to say directly what she needed, who had learned to be useful long before she'd learned that being useful was not the same as being valued. She was not fixed. He was not fixed. And the ranch was not fixed. There was always something, always a fence section, or a water problem, or a question of finances that sat at the edge of solvable without crossing it. And Iron Ridge was not transformed, was still a small, rough frontier town with all the smallness and roughness that implied. And Caleb would leave someday, probably, to have his own life somewhere. And Lydia would grow up and have opinions that nobody could predict, and some of them would be difficult. None of it was fixed. None of it was finished. That was the thing nobody told you about the life you built, rather than the life you were given. It was not a destination. You did not arrive at it and stop. It was a direction, a daily choosing of the same direction, and some days the choosing was easy, and some days it cost you. And either way you kept going because the thing you were building was worth the building. Lydia grabbed the window glass with one flat palm and pressed her face toward it, fogging it with her breath, and then turned to look at Evelyn with an expression of pure delight, as if fogging glass was the most significant achievement she could imagine. "I know," Evelyn said. "It's remarkable." The back door opened and Silas came in from the barn, cold air coming in with him, and he pulled the door shut and stomped snow from his boots and looked up and saw them at the window. Evelyn and Lydia, fog on the glass, morning light coming in around them. And he stopped for a moment, just stood there. Evelyn looked at him across the kitchen. He looked back. "Coffee's ready," she said. He came across the kitchen and took Lydia from her with the ease that had grown into something so natural it had stopped being notable. Just a man taking his daughter, adjusting her weight on his arm, pressing his cold from outside cheek briefly to her warm forehead, which made her grab his ear with immediate proprietary confidence. He poured his coffee one-handed. He sat down at the table. Lydia pulled his ear. He made a face at her and she laughed. Really laughed, the full-body laugh of a baby who has discovered that faces are funny. And the sound of it filled the kitchen the way sounds fill a space that has been empty for a long time. Evelyn sat across from them with her own coffee, and the morning came in through the window, and the snow on the ridge caught the light and held it. There are people who believe that the hardest thing is surviving what breaks you. And that is hard. She knew that, had lived it, did not minimize it. But the harder thing, the thing that requires more of you than surviving does, is deciding after the breaking that you will not let the break be the last word. That you will take the pieces and stay in the room and keep going and let yourself slowly, imperfectly, at significant personal cost, be part of something again. That was what Silas had done, without knowing he was doing it, when he'd hired a stranger with no references and an unstated history and put her in the room next to his daughter and gone to bed not knowing if she'd still be there in the morning. That was what Evelyn had done when she'd stayed. Neither of them had known that was what they were doing. They'd thought they were just surviving winter. But survival and building look the same from the inside at the beginning. You only see the difference later when you look back from somewhere warm. Outside, the snow on Iron Ridge lay clean and deep, and the East Creek ran clear beneath its ice, and the cattle were in the lower pasture, and the ridge stood above it all exactly as it had always stood, solid and indifferent and permanent in the way that landscape is permanent, not caring what happened in the houses at its base, not recording any of it, not needing to. The recording was done by the people themselves, in documents and signed agreements and the memory of neighbors who had watched and made their choices. In a child who would grow up knowing that the house she was raised in had been a place worth fighting for. In a man and a woman sitting across a kitchen table in February, drinking coffee, not saying much, not needing to. That was the legacy. Not dramatic, not perfect, just real and lasting and entirely their own.